Good evening. As you're able, please join us in the hall here, and we will begin our wonderful program for this evening. I want to begin by saying good evening and welcome to tonight's Pat Reif Memorial Lecture, and with a featuring Max Dashu as our presenter this night. My name is Janet Cromwell, and on behalf of Pilgrim Place's A Woman's Perspective, I want to express our delight in having you join us here this evening for this very special event. Whether you are here in person, watching over at the Pitzer Lounge, or online, we are delighted that we can be together for this evening. As we begin the program, I do want to thank those who have made this evening possible, including our colleagues at the Claremont Graduate University, the Immaculate Heart Community, members of A Woman's Perspective, and especially our Pilgrim Place residents, Diane Kinney and Karen Jo Torgerson, who serve on the official Pat Reif Memorial Lecture Committee. We are also very fortunate and indebted to our Lou Fry, who is serving as our Sights and Sounds man tonight. He will be recording this evening's presentation in order that others may enjoy it in the future. A Woman's Perspective was founded by the late Pilgrim Place residents Anne Mugru Bennett and Nell Morton. Both were influential feminist theologians who increased the awareness of women's issues and concerns both here at Pilgrim Place and in the much wider community as well. Together, they highlighted the contributions that women make to enrich our intellectual life, our social consciousness, in addition to strategies for activism and systematic change. In the same way, Sister Pat Reif was another highly influential educator, mentor, and resident of Pilgrim Place prior to her passing. Anne Hay of the Immaculate Heart Community will offer a few words about Sister Pat Reif before we view a film on her life and legacy, followed by Max's fascinating lecture tonight. So again, welcome. We're so pleased you're here, and we look forward to a wonderful evening together. Anne?
All right, thank you, Janet. That was a lovely introduction. Well, good evening. It's always good to be at Pilgrim Place. My name is Ann Heyman. Actually, it's the Reverend Ann Heyman. And officially, I am a retired Presbyterian minister. However, I flunked retirement completely, and am currently serving as the interim pastor at Knox Presbyterian Church in Los Angeles. So it's been my pleasure to serve on the Pat Reif Lecture Committee. Oh my gosh, I guess since the beginning. I never really thought about that, but I guess I have been around that long. This was, we're talking 1982, I suppose. I was just 2 years into a fledgling ministry with prostitutes, the Mary Magdalene Project. Some of you may well be familiar with that. And I was a little bit over my head, I think you could say. And of course, my solution to that was to go back to school. So I actually, one of the graduate schools that I applied to was CGU, but in the course of the process, they informed me that I would be learning a couple of more dead languages. And I think it was Ugaritic and Sanskrit, if I'm not mistaken. And my problems in ministry did not seem to be much aligned with, so anyway, I actually petitioned to study sign language in Spanish. I thought that made a whole lot more, well, they didn't like it. So anyway, that whole process came to a grinding halt, and my very dear friend, Bear Ride, whom I'm sure most of you know, called me one day kind of out of the blue and said, this woman named Pat Reif is going to start a master's degree program in feminist spirituality. And she said, I think I am going to look into this. Do you want to go with me? So, I mean, talk about an answer to a prayer that was never really asked, but was certainly you know, to be asked. I said, absolutely. So we met with Pat, and this was my first introduction to her, but she was absolutely phenomenal. And antithetical to everything I understood a Catholic nun to be. I mean, I'm sure I was living with an abundance of stereotypes in that particular area, but Pat was just wonderful, and her program was designed around weekends with all of these feminist scholars who were newly published. We had Rosemary Ruther and Mary Hunt, and oh my God, the list was just endless. And they would come in for a weekend. We would sit at their feet and study, write them a paper, and after X number of classes and accrued points, we would get a master's degree. Well, Pat made me graduate after 10 years. Well, it was the fountain at which I drank. That was just all there was to it. She saved my life. She really did. And things started to make sense. I was dealing with this very patriarchal institution, prostitution, and the women who I was working with had also bought the mythology, hook, line, and sinker. And so to be able to look at that with a different perspective was just life-saving for all of us. It truly was. I even brought some of them to some of the lectures. They loved it. It was great. And Pat had no problem with that whatsoever. So anyway, it was a phenomenal experience. And I'm sorry it's no longer around. It would still benefit us, I think, probably all very, very well. There is a video that was filmed at La Casa de Maria, which was up in Santa Barbara. Still there. Okay, still there. And it's a great video. It tells so much about her from people who knew her actually probably better even than I did. But I'm going to have them show that at this stage of the game, and then Karen Torgerson will come and introduce our speaker. All right.
I can see Pat walking around here. There's many oak trees here. Some of them have been here for hundreds of years. And they're strong and they survive almost anything. And I think of Pat, and her strength. I think of her love for the environment, her wanting to have the whole universe healthy. And I think it's a great symbol for Pat, because I think of her big heart and her holding everybody, holding the universe, holding all people, holding animals, and this house has held everybody. My friend Pat Reif was a nun, as I was. She went to St. Louis University, and she also did some work at Oxford, and that's because she was also going to be teaching at Immaculate Heart College.
Here at home, a group of nuns decided recently that they would break with the Vatican altogether, but would continue much of the work they had been doing. ABC's Dick Shoemaker has a report from Los Angeles.
The 500 Sisters own and operate a Catholic girls' college near Hollywood and Vine. In 1967, the sisters started a minor rebellion. They decided it was time to discard the traditional black habit. It was time, they said, to set their own lifestyles, to pray and work where and when they wanted.
There were 600 sisters at the peak of the order, no longer connected as a canonical institute to Rome.
I think for the Immaculate Heart community, we had taken a bold step, and that seems like a really feminist thing to do. We weren't bowing to male hierarchical dominance. We were standing up against it. Then what happened is, as Pat became more and more a feminist, she educated the community.
Pat created the feminist spirituality program at a time when this scholarship was just budding. It was just beginning.
She had wide contact with theologians and philosophers. So she was able to staff the program with eminent scholars throughout those years.
It was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. She set it up on the weekends. She brought in feminist theologians who could address those particular topics. So it didn't matter whether it was economics or immigration or mental illness or addictions or violence against women. She wasn't afraid of any of that stuff.
Her early understanding of the importance of religion as part of feminist studies in general, what's now sometimes called gender studies, but she really understood that religion couldn't be left out of that, and that to leave it out was to leave out a real factor, kind of an engine, if you will, for discrimination and for oppression that could in fact be turned around, as the great theologian Dan McGuire says, with its renewable moral energy.
I was arrested with her. We were part of the group called U.S. Out of El Salvador, and we did a resistance, civil disobedience downtown in front of the federal building. Yes, right here in Los Angeles. So there must have been about 60 or 70, maybe 80 of us. And when you go to jail like that, you're all put in the same room. And so you really get to know people, waiting to see what's going to happen.
Pat says, as we're walking outside after that little jury trial, she said, "So, how do you feel about being guilty?" And so people are saying, "Well, I don't feel guilty," and blah, blah, blah. And she engaged us in a little conversation about that. And she said, "Well, there's alternative language for that, don't you?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Some people would call it being faithful. I do."
When she suddenly got ill, she was also in Claremont and was even closer, and there was more chance to speak with her. And it went really fast. And so when she died, all of us had this powerful feeling that her presence needed to continue.
The IHM women that I coordinate this lecture series with have been wonderful to know. And just knowing more about Pat Reif, the more I know about her, the more I am just enamored of who she was as a person, as an activist, because she took chances and she took risks.
How do we honor Pat Reif's legacy? So the way for us to do that, again, is to think hard on what was important to her, to bring forward issues in social activism, social justice, to think about issues around women's spirituality, about sometimes resistance to women's movements, women's activism, women's spirituality even, and to see how these issues are still active and live. So this is very much what we try to do as a program. And the lecture itself is a way to kind of to bring that moment into focus.
Back in January, there was a huge mud and debris slide. Huge boulders and mud came down the mountain, and it destroyed 9 of our buildings. And it surrounded this house with mud, but it didn't come into the house. It had a spiritual strength. Somebody said to the mud and the boulders, "You can go somewhere else, but don't come here." And they didn't. And I feel like that's kind of the kind of strength Pat had. Somebody could do something somewhere else, but not where she was.
It's always so moving to spend a little time with Pat. I treasure this moment, and I am delighted to be with you. I'm Karen Torgeson. I guess you met me in the video, and we have been now many years bringing into Claremont some of the leading feminist voices in religion, and we have done good by ourselves this weekend, you'll see. I'm going to give a quick introduction to our guest speaker. I want to start back in 1968. Some of you were there, more than a normal crowd like this I address, but it's easy to forget. 1968, Max Dashu, after working hard for 4 years, received a full fellowship to Harvard University. She wanted to study women, and she went to Harvard in 1968. It was just the very beginning, the cutting edge of the second women's movement. But in 1968, you couldn't study women at Harvard or anywhere else. It wasn't a subject. There wasn't research. There weren't women professors. History, as we said at the time, was a story of men, his story. So the question was, how do you create a history for women? You rarely find them in histories of empires, accounts of battles, or in royal inscriptions, or in scholarly scrolls. History is what is written in texts. That's the situation that Max faced. She had dropped out of Harvard. She needed a new way and a new vision, and she was a pioneer. The genius of Max Dashow's work is that she turned to archaeology and art, sculptures, paintings, clay figurines, bas-relief, rock art, and carvings on stone, bones, rocks. And she made slides and later digital images of everything she could find. She built a collection of 15,000 slides and 30,000 digital images. You can see the change in the technology there. A total of 45,000 pieces of data on the missing women. These pictures, then, she collected from all over the world, from Africa, just 3 countries I want to give you a flavor: Egypt, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, the Americas, Southwest Pueblos, Ecuador, Mexico, Asia, ancient India, China, Afghanistan, Europe, Portugal, Crete, Slavic culture. I'm just naming a few. It was around the world. And it was from rock art that was prehistoric to contemporary indigenous cultures that still preserved the traditions that they had been practicing for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this treasure, this global database, she called the Suppressed Histories Archive. With this, then, the challenge was to answer what the questions that contemporary women were asking. Did women have political power? Did women have religious authority? Dashu's work bridges the gap between academia and grassroots education. She highlights female spheres of power and focuses on women shamans, priestesses, witches and witch trials, folk religion, and pre-Christian pagan European traditions. As an independent scholar, I think this is really important because she could not have done the work she did if she had stayed within academia, and we would be without this treasure if she had stayed. As an independent scholar, she reached a broader audience. She has presented hundreds of slide talks at universities, community centers, feminist bookstores, coffee shops, schools, libraries, prisons, galleries, festivals, and conferences. She is a grassroots woman. Out of her suppressed History's archives. She has created dozens and dozens of videos that reach large audiences through YouTube. Just an example, lectures on women shamans, 12,000. Women of the ancient Sahara, 9.7 thousand. Judea Capta, women in Israel during Roman times, 3.7 thousand. That's her outreach. That's her impact. I recommend this. It is a feast to browse through this library of videos and meet the world's forgotten women. It's in the website, Suppressed Histories Archives. So be sure you have that. It's not as easy to find under her name. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Max Dashu.
Well, I'm not hearing it. Are you hearing me? Okay, here we go. I'm not sure if I'm being picked up on this, though. Am I being picked up? Whatever. It's working. Okay. All right. Bien. I'm so moved. Thank you for that introduction. Karen Torgerson really sees me and what I've the path that I followed through the marginal corners to get to this point where this is being seen. And I'm going to be sharing now with you, not going to be talking about patriarchy, colonialism, and a lot of the other subjects I cover, because I really want to give you a scan of the cultural record that looks at positive heritages of women that have been withheld from us, either deliberately or unconsciously. All of that is, I'm not sure if I need to point this anywhere. But, as Karen was touching on, history is something that, we could say that it's an affirmation of what's valued, what a culture considers important, or rather what the hegemonic powers ruling a culture decide to highlight. But it's not just what men wrote down, whether it's the priestly scriptures or the dynastic genealogies or the narratives of kings and conquerors, because there is also all these other sources. And one that has been really deprecated is indigenous orature. And yet this is really a very important lineage, which, the assumption was, well, they don't really remember things for very long, and this can't reflect realities going back thousands of years, which is being disproven by Australian orature that refers to things that are now coming through in scientific studies of palm trees, for example, that were brought from the coast a very long time ago. But we have indigenous women come to the forefront in many of these stories, these oral traditions, these oral histories, because we find stories of first woman, female founders, cultural inventors, beginners of agriculture, medicine women who originated things, all of this. And we also have stories about migrations and conquests and patriarchal coups, overthrows of women power that is said to have once existed, but no more, when the men got together and sometimes killed all the women in some of the stories. But so this is our process of recovery, is stories that were erased, crushed, divided, split up, buried, and silenced under conquest and various forms of domination. So this is our quest, is to begin to regather all these ripped webs, shreds of culture that have been withheld from us. And so, this is something that the powers that be dictate. What makes it not only into the dynastic histories, but also what is put into the great narrative books. When I began my research, there was The Dawn of Man, Time Life books. And it was kings and generals and male religious leaders and sometimes philosophers or scientists. And the women, if you were lucky, you got a few concubines or queens. But the women were invisible, yet in the little corners, occasionally you would see ancient Neolithic figurines, in black and white, of course, not full-page plates. So we know this intuitively as women. Indigenous people know it very well about the misrepresentations, distortions, and outright lies about what all has happened. And, so we have all these media forms, and we're really living this now with the monopoly media platforms that, what gets highlighted, who controls what is seen, what stories are told. And especially the way racism and sexism converge in our view of the world, the Eurocentrism of the narratives. We've seen a lot of reform of this in the past 50 years, but we still have a ways to go in this. And there's a withholding. It's what's withheld that really interests me. So we have to go and look and scan the entire cultural record. And this includes rock art, and I'm going to be looking at some of that in a little minute, exploring all kinds of avenues of information which are sometimes not found in histories, but if you go and look at the story of weaving, and sometimes goddess traditions are interwoven there in the orature. There's a lot of lines of connection. And so we have, in recovering women's history, gone into entire worlds that the gatekeepers didn't want us to know about. The poster there is the one that I did that's called Female Icons, and they're from all over the world, not just Southwest Asia, which we tend to see, or even Mexico, but also places like Manchuria and Zimbabwe and Costa Rica. All of this is there to be found. It's just that we have to dig and uncover it. So I want to begin with some examples of rock art, because there are a lot of pieces of rock art that represent male hunters, are done by men, but there are also images like this from the Sahara, which has one of the oldest repositories of rock art, rock paintings, and petroglyphs in the world. And so from the eastern Sahara there on the left, you see a woman with gold jewelry who is hefting what looks like is a spear. And then the other one is quite a bit later, but from Chad. And if you look at this closely, you will see elements of this rock art that reflect, like for example, the multiple necklaces is something that we see in Egyptian art. There's a certain similarity to Egyptian painting, ancient Egyptian painting in this. But she has waist beads, which are an attribute that's very common in West and Central Africa. And so you can see also through lines culturally over many, many millennia in these regions. So one of the most important groups of rock paintings are from an area called Tassili Niger in southeastern Nigeria, and actually spans over into what's now Libya as well. And so this one has been named the Lady of Awanjet by the Amazigh people that live there now. And so we have, is it a goddess? Is it a woman? Is it a priestess or an ancestor? We can't know, because this painting is probably 6,000 to 8,000 years old. And so we see a woman possibly horned. That's one take on this. She has numinous dots all around her, showing power flowing. She has attached to her arms and her legs fringes. Ritual ties is what I came to call these in the Woman Shaman DVD that we have there. And then her hands are covered. Are they puppets? Are they some kind of covering with strands? Are they dance regalia of some kind? We don't really know. But there's a lot of speculation, because there are things we can't know. We don't have a through line of orature to inform us about this. But this rock art in the Sahara, we see evidence of cultural activity, including possibly ceremonial dances. There are some that indicate possible womanhood initiations in these ancient paintings in Algeria, and also of women leading ceremony. So my take on this is it's probably a hunting ceremony, because a man is kneeling and presenting his bow, and a woman is bending over and appears to be blowing on maybe the arrow, but as we'll see, I think it's probably a staff. And there's a whole group of people engaged in this. So here's the close-up. And so the woman, maybe she's holding a staff like the one that the elder behind her is holding. And the ritual staff is a huge category of medicine woman's ceremonial regalia that I found when I was making the Woman Shaman video. But in any case, maybe it's an arrow, maybe it's a staff. And both of these women have their heads painted with red ochre, the blood of the earth. So like a potentizing their spirit in the head in these paintings. But we have others that are also extremely old in the Dakhla oasis in the western desert of Egypt. And so we have very broad-bodied women there. The waist beads again, but with these very elaborate fanned headdresses that they're wearing. So again, ceremonial leadership by women comes through in the rock art. And we see it as well. This is a very interesting painting from Al-Mestakawi cave in Gulf al-Kebir. It's a big rock formation at the corner where Egypt, Libya, and Sudan come together. And you see women with their arms raised in invocation. There's a crack in the rock which the artist seems to have taken as a river, because their reflections appear below them. But compare the gesture of the women on this rock painting maybe older, I don't know, to the deware ceramics of the Nakada culture that are in the 4th millennium BCE. And this gesture of invocation or benediction comes through over and over again in the Nakada culture of Egypt. So this is all before the pharaohs. And you see women in ceremonial boats. There's usually a tree affixed to the stern of the boat, and they have this gesture. Are they goddesses who are giving benediction? Are they priestesses who are calling in divine? And then a connection also to modern culture, because Eastern African women in Uganda and Rwanda still do the cattle dance, and they're actually making the gesture of the horns of the sacred cattle that are the basis of their culture. So this is a very strong theme. It is the central theme in the iconography, and that, I'm not going to go into depth about this, but I have a little video about it on the YouTube channel, Max Dashu channel. So, because these figures also appear as the so-called vulture goddesses with the bird-shaped faces in figurines. They appear in murals and other kinds of symbolism. And we see them also. Here's another example of a petroglyph from Nubia with a whole group of women making this sacred gesture. So then the invoking woman also appears in Arabia. So Western Arabia, especially in the Najran region, there are numerous images of women calling in power. And you can see also that rock dust has been ground out from the area of her breasts and her vulva. So there is an extraction of the rock itself, the stone dust, for ritual use. And this is a pattern we see all over the world. In California, women at the Pomo baby rocks would do this in order, some kind of ceremony to conceive. Further north, the Hupa people use it in rainmaking ceremonies. So there are a lot of possibilities, but it's good to be aware of this. One of the ways that this has manifested in a very global way in an extremely early period are the vulva petroglyphs. And here's an example from northeastern Australia in a canyon, a river canyon. But they are found in Paleolithic Europe, they're found in Mexico and Baja California and too many places. I have a whole slideshow on these vulva stones. And then also, too, the vulva is sacred in the most best known form being the Sheela-na-gigs of Ireland, England, and Western Europe mostly. But you can see here there are examples from Costa Rica and India and Australia and Nepal and many other places. So this is not pornography. This is the potency of the progenitrix, the sacrality of female sexuality as well. And so we have in some of these petroglyphs representations of ancestral women. This is a very important theme. And when we talk about goddess or the female divine, I see it as a spectrum. There's a continuum, and you have at one end creatrix figures and great mothers, but then you also go into the ancestral women of living human communities. And somewhere else in there, you have the divine principles in the form of Ma'at, Wird in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, or Tao in the Chinese tradition. So this idea of divinity has many manifestations. But here again, from Arabia, some more examples of the invoking women, as well as, these are some of the regional shows that I've put together to try and go from the very earliest period, and then move forward in time and show the transformations that go on historically across time. And so the Canaanite and Hebrew goddesses, this is a really huge show because the iconography is so vast and so ancient, but many themes that recur over long periods. Again, the conservationism of culture. And then ancient Sudan. So this is still the Nile Valley. In the very early periods, culturally, they're very close to Egypt. They have the same kind of red and black wear. The figurines are very similar. But they have their own historical trajectory that has been mostly eclipsed by attention to Egypt, but very rich. And so that actually is on my YouTube channel. You can see the whole video for open access. And so each of these regions, the study of Central American archaeology and history, South American, Australian, Pacifica, and so we're looking at iconography, some of it ancient, some of it modern, oral traditions, written culture where that exists, any kind of stream of information. Sometimes there are oral genealogies like the Maori have. And some regions are really overlooked. So this presentation on southeastern Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi, this is an area where oracular women are a very, very strong theme. And we have female founders in Zimbabwe. One of the most important traditions was the Makewana. I guess I'll come to that later, in Malawi. But also, when we look at European history, we've had a skewed view because the focus has been on the conquering states. But what about before the Romans? What was going on in Italy in the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, and even in later periods, with the Etruscans and the Veneti and other peoples? And so we have to look at each region and try to somehow integrate what's available to us in written form, iconographic form, and orature. And sometimes that orature, in the case of the Norse sagas, gets written down. So it gets frozen in time, so we have sort of an older artifact to draw on than modern folklore. Same with Britain. There's much to be discovered because there has been really a systematic disregarding of the female presence in human history. And this has been especially prominent in the history of our own country here in North America, where we have these red flint icons. None of us were taught this in school. We weren't taught about medieval nor ancient Mississippian cultures. And on some of these, the archaeologists have observed, like, for example, the tray that she's holding is connected with the green corn ceremonies in living cultures. And so the Cahokian, this is the area where you have the great earthen mounds outside of St. Louis area, but in Illinois. And so you have a woman here with a hoe. She's farming, and this North America is women's farming heartland. They were the three sisters, the corn, squash, and beans, were what they raised. But if you turn this sculpture around, and you can see it's been ritually broken, she's hoeing the back of a giant serpent. And its tail turns into a vine that crawls up her back, and it's a gourd vine. So lots more to be understood about this. But when the archaeologists begin to look at Osage and Pawnee traditions, other native orature from this area, they discover connections. For example, the ears of corn that are used ceremonially by so many North American farming peoples. But these are pipes of the corn mother, and the pipes are instruments of prayer, of communication between humans, heavens, and earth. And so we have these women pipes. Some of them hold baskets. There's one known as the Keller figurine, or Keller pipe, that she has apparently a weaving implements in front of her, sacred weaver. But this one from Ohio in Preble County, and you don't see this in any art histories, this beautifully carved pipe, her body is the pipe. And so the prayers are with these images. Now, at the left side there, you can see the Cherokee clay pipes in woman form. But then if we go all the way into the Tapajos Valley of Brazil, you have woman pipes very, very parallel in form. And so this is something that's Pan-American, and tobacco being a great sacrament to all of these societies. Then the sculptural traditions, because we get all of the Roman emperors and we get the various gods in various parts of the world, but what about these large stone sculptures from the Tehuantepec, or was the modern Mexicans call them the Huastec culture in eastern Mexico? We have these majestic women wearing ceremonial headdresses, some of which are the jaws of animals that their heads emerge from. The theme that is also seen, by the way, in Nicaragua in some of their megalithic architecture. And in this same region also there are large ceramic sculptures, like 4 feet tall, of women who are deified mothers who died in childbirth. And so their mouths are open as if they're chanting, but they're actually representing dead women, ancestors who become protectors, figures that the Aztecs referred to as the Cihuateteo, meaning the woman spirit or women deities. So then we come to the murals in Teotihuacan. This is pre-Aztec. The Aztecs drew on this more ancient culture. And there are these fantastic paintings. We all know about the Great Pyramids in Mexico, but the goddess here shown with flowering branches in her hands, elaborate headdress, face painted up, and in front of her mountaintops with lunar aspects shown on each one of them. Here's the great masterpiece of Teotihuacan. Esther Pastori calls her the great goddess of Teotihuacan. Her hands outstretched, blessings in the form of sacred water pouring out with all kinds of shells and living beings and attributes coming forth from her. She's got the half mask with the jaguar. She's crowned by the green bird headdress. And these jaguar half masks, I don't have them in this show, but they are also found priestesses of the Moche culture in Peru who are very prominent spiritual leaders in the Andes. So we have murals out of the Pueblo world in New Mexico and in Arizona. You can see the basket dance with the corn there already showing up, women holding up the sacred prayer feathers, and many, many others. Most people have heard of the Ajanta cave paintings, and there are some wonderful masterpieces showing us what women looked like in the 5th century BCE in India. And very, very rich realms of culture there. But most have not seen, I just recently discovered these Ladakhi murals from the Western Himalayas. And this is a fusion of Tibetan and Indian and also East Iranian peoples, the Sakas. So there's always new things coming to light. And same with the murals in Georgia. These are rather late. There are others that go back to the 12th century. The Queen Tamar, who was one of the great rulers, actually, of the Georgian kingdom. And the Etruscan murals in their beautiful tombs. Lots of riches. That's a whole other visual talk. The Aegean Islands. Crete, of course, most of us have been exposed to some of the fabulous goddesses, priestesses, ecstatic ceremonies. There's a lot of seals that most people haven't seen, though. I'm going to be putting this Cretan shows up, open access, hopefully next year, because what they show is ecstatic dance in which women sometimes shapeshift into birds. Their arms turn into wings. It's just like there's just this phenomenal record of ecstatic culture and the Cretan reverence for nature that permeates all of their cultural production. And something that we're not so well informed upon are the female statue menhirs of the megalithic cultures in Western Europe. And so these megalithic statues, there are also males represented in parts of Europe, but in some areas the women are predominant. And this to me bespeaks probably a matrilineal culture. We have northern France is one of those areas. Another is northwestern Italy and southwestern Italy and Spain. And this is where you see a very strong female ancestor imagery coming through. Iran is basically unknown. I mean, we know about the Persian Empire and, mostly through the Greeks. It's already through a lens of bias, but there is extremely rich iconography in the Neolithic cultures of Iran, and especially in Kerman around the 25th century BCE. There are cylinder seals. Do I have one on there? Yeah, you can see it at the center area of horned goddesses with serpents emerging out of their shoulders. Ibex goddesses, dancing women, all kinds of amazing treasures. And part of that probably Indo-Iranian speaking cultural complex also in what's now Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, is the Bactria Margiana culture. And one of their primary icons, probably the primary icon recognizably in their sculpture, are seated women wearing kaunakis robes that are inspired by old Sumerian dress, kind of twisted wool robes. One of the things that was really hard for me to research for the first 20 years or so was ancient China, because there is a very long history of patriarchy in China. But then I began to uncover the Wu. And these are medicine women or female shamans, priestesses, which you can see this is a bronze offering vessel, and you see them actually shown making offerings, probably to the ancestors or to heaven and earth, actually depicted on the scene. And women are dancing, they're making invoking gestures, they're playing gongs and stone chimes suspended from the ceilings of their temples. And this is all in somewhere around the 4th century BCE. There's this explosion of imagery depicting the Wu. Spain is another place we do get the sculptures of the Greeks and Romans, but not so much of the offerant women in the Iberian culture southeastern Spain. And you've probably seen La Dama de Elche, but there's a whole body of limestone sculptures that are really important. And the Nok sculptures of central Nigeria start to appear around mid-first millennium BCE. And they're fantastic. So when I first came across these, all I could find was images of men. And I had to be open to the possibility that that was all there was. But of course, that was not true. It was what the gatekeepers chose to picture in their articles or books about them. And it turns out there are all these rich images of women. And this is very parallel later on. There's a cultural development over the next 1,500 years. So in the early medieval period, you start to see portrait heads, probably of royals, at Ile-Ife, which is kind of the navel of Yoruba culture, in the birthplace, maybe, of the Yoruba culture. And so, we have been told all along, the women, as the Shah of Iran told Oriana Fallaci about women, you've done nothing, you've achieved nothing, and there's all of this. And so we have these ancestor figures, many of them from cultures that are known to be matrilineal, but even those who are not, there is the presence of the matricultural. So we also find stories of female chieftains in the matrilineal cultures, the Chibchan-speaking societies of northern Colombia and going up into Central America. And beautiful sculptures there of the ancestral women. But we also find these beaten gold breastplates. So the symbolism is the iconography of maternal power. This is the social bond in these societies, in the Chibchan cultures of the Senu, the Tairona, who are the ancestors probably of the Kogi peoples, and then also the Quimbaya culture, which produced a tremendous amount of incredible beaten gold sculpture, much of it also is of women. But the breasts also show up indoors of the surviving matrilineal societies in Timor. This is eastern Indonesia. Most of the cultures on the island have become patrilineal, but not this one. And so there's this symbolism of the maternal ancestor, often breasts with a necklace above them, and also these amazing spiral indications of perhaps the vastness of the place of origin. But the woman on the door, the woman on also the walls, and this is southern Germany along Lake Constance. And they found a lodge that had the ancestors of all the clans of the community on the walls of a communal lodge. They were plastered walls, and they molded these breasts that stuck out from the walls. And then they painted them with the same numinous dotted patterns that we saw from Tassili Najir, and which show up over and over again in living Australian culture. So these, to me, are mother-law cultures, and this is a term that I have come across in a couple indigenous societies as a name for matriarchal systems, as their name. And we'll go into that some more. The mother-law cultures, but I do want to point out with the, let's see if I can actually use the pointer, this one here. This is from the Nuba in Sudan. So they are matrilineal but patrilocal culture, which has been pretty well devastated by Islamist invasions and bombings. But the traditional household had the breasts of the ancestral mother on the walls, and above it offerings of sorghum and beans, which are your complete protein staff of life. So these offerings and the connections of ancestors to the life-giving rains, this is all an integrated whole. So the first place that I found this naming of mother-law was the Adat Ibu of the Minangkabau, which is the largest surviving matrilineal society, except maybe for the Navajo. And you can see the carriage of these women. They are not shrinking violets. They have dignity and authority within, because the land passes through the women. And they are the core of a matrilocal society. The central pillar of the longhouse, the Rumah Gadang, is called after Bundu Kanduang, and this is the ancestral founder. She's the first woman in Minang oral tradition. Own mother is the translation of that title. And living women all bear that title. Whoever is the authoritative clan mother continues to bear that title. But the longhouses, Minangkabau means victorious buffalo. So they beat off invading Islamic armies in the 16th century, and they had to make an accommodation with them. But the story says that they said, look, let's not fight. Let's have a duel between our buffaloes. You bring your best buffalo, we'll bring ours. And so the Javanese brought their biggest, toughest male buffalo bull that they could get. And the Javanese had a little baby bull that they deprived of milk for a day or two and attached knives on the bottom, on its horns. And so the bull couldn't be bothered to try and fight this little calf, but the baby was trying desperately to get milk and is stabbing the other bull with its horns, seeking to suckle from this male bull. So the houses are in the form of the buffalo horns, and the women's headdresses are in the form of the buffalo horns. And this is part of a much older complex of Indonesian societies where they were buffalo cultures, water buffalo, not bison. Then last year, or maybe it was the year before, I found that the Mohawk women were talking about their culture as mother-in-law culture. And so this is the Six Nations of the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, which means the people of the Longhouse. And so the Longhouse, just like they have longhouses in Minangkabau, also in northeastern America, the Lenape people also had longhouses. And their oral tradition, eventually written down as the Great Law of Peace, has the white roots of peace at the base of the cedar, and they are over the weapons of war. This is a society that is saying, we're going to live peacefully. We're not going to fight anymore amongst ourselves. And so this written tradition now says that the descent of the people of the five nations shall run in the female line. Women are progenitors of the nation. They will own the land and the soil. Men and women shall follow the status of their mothers. And this is the law they continue to follow. So when we were all told back in the day, in the arguments about, well, there can't be matriarchy because men have always dominated, but if there was matriarchy, it would be the same thing as patriarchy. And it's not. It's not a reverse of patriarchy. It's a completely different pattern, a different paradigm, really. So we've struggled with all these different namings of what do we call these societies, because in the 70s, when we tried to talk about matriarchy, it would turn into screaming matches where people were like, well, you can't oppress men, that would be just as bad, and it was ridiculous. So, different namings have come up. I came up with Matrix Society around 2000, trying to reason with this headbutting. And you have Guy Lanny that Rian Eisler came up with, and many other forms. Canadian Indigenous women came up with matriculture. But this group of words are interesting because mater, mother, also is related to matrix, which means womb or source. And of course, material or substance also is from that same root, matter. But then matrix, even in mathematics and physics, you have this idea of relationality, of the way things are situated in relation to each other within a certain kind of pattern. And so there's a lot of meaning to this. So when we talk about matricultures, there are certain patterns, and I don't claim that they're all present in all societies, because patriarchy is a historical process, and it hasn't proceeded in the same ways, or even at all in some places, in the same time. But you have the lineage through the mother, you have matrilocal residence. Why is that important? It means that the woman is not separated from her kin. You don't get battery inside a marriage under those conditions. The sex egalitarian, in the core Aboriginal traditions, you don't have a class hierarchy. That's something that does develop historically. You have communitarian houses and lands. And the key male-female relation is sister-brother, not husband-wife. It's the blood tie, not the legal tie. Why is this important? I think we can figure that out pretty easily, because there is the coercion necessary to maintain a patrilineal system. The African American proverb said, mama's baby, papa's maybe. So how are you going to know without controlling women's sexuality and movement? And I'm not going to read all of these, but I want to emphasize the importance of social motherhood. Because we live in a society of the nuclear family where women are isolated with the load of caregiving responsibilities, not only for children, but for disabled people, elders, or whoever, on them. But in a social motherhood framework, all the sisters and all the brothers are responsible collectively. And the upper generations, the old elders taking care of the youngers, and all of these things are going on. And this is something we need desperately to understand in order to change the way that women become trapped under their responsibilities, as well as impoverished. So anyway, there's a lot of other traits there. But here's some other names for mother right cultures. Marumakatayam in Kerala, in Malayalam language, and literally sisters' children. So that's the social motherhood, because all the children of sisters, the aunties are all called mother. The children are all considered sisters and brothers rather than cousins. And there are various other names in Indian castes, like the Mapila caste, means mother-child. Then other clan names talk about embodied kinship, and one group has to do with milk, the life-sustaining power of the milk givers. Whoops, sorry. So Susu, milk bond among the Dobu culture. You have the Itabapisili in the Chickasaw culture, and those who are related because they suckle at the same breasts. Not the single set of breasts, but the whole set of breasts of the female kindred there. And even the Greeks, who were patriarchal, still had this concept of homogalactis, those who drink milk, the same milk. And so there are a lot of different variations, and another has to do with the womb. And so names for clans that mean of one womb. And so the Manang is one example, the Perut clan name, Yafunu means the same thing in the Ashanti culture of Ghana, Karindash of the shores in North Asia. And even with Hebrew, again, B'nai Batni, you can see this in the Bible, the children of my womb. So there are various forms of that. And we also see names for ancestral women. And so the elder woman of a matrilineage among the Khasi in northeastern India is called Kiyaube Tenre, mother of the root. So the ancestral women. Often they are being actually materially honored, as we saw in the Nuba house with the breasts, but here in southern Congo, the Kishikishi image of the first woman is placed atop the largest lodge, the chief's lodge in modern terms, of the Bapende culture. So this idea of mother law, we have to understand it not as a hierarchical arrangement, but a framework that is based on the ethics of supporting the life matrix. And that's everybody. That's men, that's women, that's children, that's elders, who all have this goal of furthering. And so, they're not only the child bearers, but they're also the ones who sustain, who feed, who protect, who teach, and they are culture keepers. The work that they do gives them authority. Unlike in our society, women have all this responsibility, all this labor that's unpaid. It's not the point of it that it's paid or not paid, but they don't have the corresponding authority based on the contribution that they make to the society. And so, we, as I was referring to earlier, in North America, we weren't taught that a large proportion of the peoples, whether we're talking about the southeast U.S., the northeast with the Lenape and the Iroquoian peoples, the southwestern Pueblo cultures, but also the Wichita and a lot of other peoples, the northwest coast cultures, there are quite many societies that were matrilineal. So these cultures tend to be off in the corners, in the mountains, in the swamplands, areas in the deserts that were not so desirable to conquerors. That's where they're concentrated in modern times. And one of these, the most egalitarian cultures that I've studied is the Mosuo in Yunnan, which is now part of China. In ancient times it wasn't. And so there again, the bond between sisters and brothers, and you have that social motherhood going on. And men and women work together in the fields. The men have lovers off somewhere else, and the women bring in lovers. They didn't actually have marriage. They would just you're the one, you're the boss of whatever you want to do. You can do that. And then the men would come back at dawn across the hilltop trails to join their sisters in working in the fields. In Tokelau, and this is an atoll in the South Pacific, the title for the matriarch is Fatu Pai Pai, which means the stone foundation of the house of the Kagai, of the matrilineal clan. And here again, the quote that I have here emphasizing that it's not authoritarian structure, it's based on respect, everybody gets a say, there's consensus, but you have the Fatu Pai Pai as a guide, and a counselor. And they also had women's councils. And this is something, when we hear about elders, and I know those of you with a religious background, referring to the elders nearly always meant men, right? And that's not always the case. There are female elders and councils of women that, really contrast with the all-male councils that we see in modern India, for example, or the United States, the Mormons, right? Here's the Wayuu is a very interesting culture in northern Colombia. It's a desert culture. The women are weavers and makers of hammocks in modern times. But they have a women's council, and if you look closely, you see that there's a cell phone in the foot of the women's there. So this is going forward in time. And so, modern painting by Muskogee artist Joan Hill, Women's Voices at the Council. The representations of a lot of the North American societies have tended to really over-exaggerate the authority of men. And often they do take a more public leading role, but not always. And so in the case of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, you have the Council of the Gantowisas, which is their term for the word that got translated by Anglo and French invaders as the matrons of the Iroquois. They had the power to stop the men's council from going to war. They had the power to veto any decision taken by the men's council. They had economic power. There are all these balance of powers, part of which they taught. Aspects of our Constitution are based on balance of power concepts coming out of the Iroquoian Constitution, except that the founding fathers of the Anglo Republic chose not to incorporate the authority of women. I think Abigail Adams would have been very interested to know that there was this alternative to cite. So anyway, they're longhouse people. And you have many hearths inside the longhouse, all descendants from a female ancestor. And these kinds of longhouses occur in a lot of parts of the world. And they're very often connected to matrilineal cultural complexes. So for example, here in the Ode and Jarai cultures of the Vietnamese highlands, you've got ladders. It's a rainforest, so they have houses up on stilts. And you have the ancestral mother and brother. And there again are the necklace and breast motifs that we've seen already before from some of the megalithic cultures and from the Timorese. Longhouses also on the Pacific coast of Canada and Alaska. And some of these are matrilineal societies like the Haida and the Tsimshiang. And even if we go back into ancient European history, we have longhouses also. This is from the island of Jersey. It's a reconstructed longhouse with the thatch. They have a whole group of post holes in Central Europe called the Russen culture that also show that that was going on over much of Europe in, say, the 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. And then other times, roundhouses. And this is another pattern, both in the northern plains of North America, but also in places like China. Earthen houses of pounded clay, which are sunk semi-subterranean, so they are cool in the summer and warm in the winter. These are also matrilineal societies. I don't know about Bida, Nigeria, but I put this in here because over the doorway, you have the mother with her arms like wings extended over the children. And this is the motif in the house. But we do have cultures that are living in Maluku Islands, for example, far, far eastern Indonesia. You have the image of the ancestral woman as an altar, and they would place offerings in the little cups on those altars. And in one case, at least, I was able to find, they're called luli, these altars, honoring the name of the woman as Hustraina Hustualina, who is remembered as the founding mother of Luhuleli village on the island of Leyte. So if we look at Europe, we have traces that we can track. Crete, I don't know if we really even want to count Crete as Europe because it's as close to Africa as it is to the mainland. But partnership societies, as Rian Eisler names them. So you have egalitarian relations between men and women. And the Greeks and Romans were both scandalized by the freedom of Etruscan women and their participation in public life, feasting, drunken banquets, or naked athletics. Partnership iconography shows up in a lot of the societies in the Americas because really the parody of the male and female images here. They're dressed a little bit differently, but they look basically the same. There's not an attempt to make these extreme gender distinctions. And in some of the societies, going back again to Yunnan, we have among the Lisu culture, women are the ones who initiate courtship. And they're serenading the men in this photograph. There are longhouse cultures, or were in southern Cambodia, where the young could just have their love affairs however they wanted to. And they had separate spaces for that. And it was just non-authoritarian and non-coercive. Another European example would be the Basques, because they still had very strong matrilineal attributes as late as the Middle Ages. And most Basque writers will allude to this in one way or another. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I could be here forever, but it's very interesting. So, okay, that's all the stuff about how much importance there is to a social structure that's egalitarian and non-authoritarian. I want to look a little bit at women's contributions to origination of technologies. And one of the most famous examples, which anthropologists settled upon years ago, is it's very likely that the women who gathered roots and nuts and fruits would observe how seeds would germinate and learn to plant. And so agriculture as a female origination is something that is referred to in orature in Southeastern Asia and various other places. But the technologies, which I'm calling mother tech here, so we've got potters and builders and weavers, and the way that all of this is integrated, the technical and the economic with the spiritual. We could go on about that in some detail. But you've got women as builders. And over most of North America, women are building the houses. In this case, the Wichita matrilineal people of Texas-Oklahoma region, thatching one of their large round lodges. But also teepees and wigwams were made by women. And not only that, but they are the ones that learned to tan the hides, who sewed not only the houses, but also created the furniture, the meat packing, the food storage, parfleche, the clothing, the shoes, everything. They're basically the manufacturers of their cultures and the owners of the lodges. And these same kinds of wigwam formations were also used in North Asia. And so you have parallel technologies around the Northern Hemisphere where women are housemaking. In the nomadic cultures of Southwestern Asia, Northern Africa, and then going over into Central Asia and Tibet, you have women weaving the tents out of goat hair, usually. And they were the owners. In ancient times, a woman could initiate divorce simply by placing his belongings outside the door, and then he knew it's over. And so Tibet, there's a lot of other examples to that. But you have actual construction with adobe bricks. This was women's sphere among the pueblos. And so the Hopi and also the New Mexico pueblos, you see actual construction going on like this even, not too much more than 125 years ago. And, the Spanish come in and they set the men to work building churches. And everybody stood around laughing because who ever heard of men building? The men did provide, and again, this is the cooperative nature of the culture, the men provided the beams, but the women did the construction. And Maasai culture in Eastern Africa, you have women building houses, and here she's got the framework already up and she's plastering with earthen walls, but they also even build the structures that the men hold ceremony in. And some amazing sculptural and painting art done by women in Burkina Faso and actually all over Africa, in Nubia, in Mauritania, all the way down through the Igbo country in West Africa, and over to Uganda, and then down to the Ndebele house painters who are famous in South Africa. But also mural painting is a thing, and we're talking about interiors now. So the Asir painting in the Asir region of Western Arabia, women house mural makers in tribal India, and then the ceramic art. So working with clay, and I'm not going to go into the female figurines, but that's part of that complex that you see there. And so learning to fire clay and then painting it or incising it with patterns. And this is the important part because a lot of times archaeologists were really shy of trying to assign any kind of meaning or interpretation to the symbols that they engraved or painted. And so here we have, of course, the famous tradition of Pueblo painting, ceramic painting, which has earlier origins in southern Mexico, New Mexico, and Arizona. And so there's a whole vast commentary to be done on that. I'm just skimming over this, except to say that a lot of the patterns are found throughout Mexico, all down through Central America, as far south as Argentina, especially the step pattern that ends in a spiral. That is found in all those places, like you see here at the lower left. And so, there is just hardly any coverage. I can find this stuff by scanning. The net has been a great boon in this way, because things that don't get published in books, you can get nice color pictures of them now. But the ceramic art of Ecuador is amazing. And not just there, Colombia and the Peruvian Amazon. Look at this, cosmic maps on these gigantic pots that are all full of cultural significance that I don't know how to read, but they do. And so I came to call this symbolism that was painted here as a scripture of signs, because you see the dancing women, and that's a motif that gives us a window into ceremonial culture, and it's an especially strong theme in Western and Southern Asia. But also, those dancing women at the very center are forming a quadrant. So you have the directions, but their hair is blowing and the directions are in motion. So it's almost as if we're looking at the time-space matrix being represented in material form. One of the themes that recurs globally in the ceramic traditions are the spiral pots. You see them in Thailand. They exist in the Costa Rica. It's found in ancient China. Here you see it from the Cucuteni Tripolia culture of going from Romania across to Ukraine. And here's some examples from Neolithic China. So, there's a whole vast, rich cultural production, and pretty well agreed that these were being, women were making this art. And not just art, it's the wrong word, because it's a whole web of meanings and ceremonial uses that are there. And then there's also weaving and the same kinds of use of symbolism, but also the cloth itself being used in birth, in weddings, in funerary ceremonies. All kinds of uses of cloth, or even as gifts between clans. And so the patterns that we see, and it's like, oh, those are nice decorations, those are designs, but they're correlated with stories very often, with meanings, symbolism. And so there are, in many cases, songs and stories attached to them. In the Slavic world, which we're looking there in the lower part, the rushniki of the Russians and various other Slavic peoples, women kept in embroidery symbolism of the divine female that were quashed by the, triumphal rule of the all-male priesthood in those countries. But they are using them to cover newborns or the dead, or a loaf of bread that's being offered in a ritual fashion to guests. All kinds of these uses that the cloth is engaged in culturally. And so, the patterns persist in time, even after Christianity, Islam, and other cultures, Buddhism, for example, supersede. You see a persistence of tree of life symbolism, of birthing women symbolism. Now to farming, just to return again to the provision aspect of women's power. We have, some areas are really disregarded because we hear about the Fertile Crescent and not the discoveries that West Africa had millet farming very, very early on in 6th millennium BCE. And you have women as food providers, as inventors of agriculture, but also all the biochemical technologies of drying and parching and smoking and salting and fermentation and leavening, all of those things, yogurts and cheeses and all of that. This is women's, but we don't have a name. Who did it? You can't write a history without giving the inventor's name, can you? Right? But women in patriarchal societies continue doing this labor. It's unpaid labor, but they are providers even if they don't have any longer control in the family. And so, in South India, women are still the primary laborers out there in the 116-degree midday sun replanting paddy. I want to turn for a moment to the prophetic traditions, and most people here will have heard of the Oracle of Delphi. In my book, which I have back there on the table, I go into much more detail about various female oracular traditions in the ancient Mediterranean. But there's a lot more than that. Well, of course, the Sibyl of Cumae would be within that. A lot of orature about the Sibyls, elaboration of the Sibyl of this place, that place, and the other. But then we also have female diviners recorded in Mesopotamian records, both in Iraq and Syria. And so the Kabatum at Mari is one group. And then even in the Bible itself, there's that passage in Exodus that calls Miriam the prophetess. And then later they sort of deride her as having, been somehow wrong and punished by God with a disfiguring disease. But the passage actually says, Miriam the prophetess went out with her drum, and all the women followed after with timbrels and with dancing. So there's the ecstatic element of the drumming and dancing that's connected with this idea that she is the prophetess. Later still, you have Ezekiel railing against the idea that women make things up and don't listen to the daughters of your people who prophesy out of their own imagination, unlike the male prophets, of course. So there's a breakdown. And the same thing, it's not just the Hebrews, the Mesopotamians go through that also. Greta Boulairi, I think that's her name, has done some really cracked scholarship on this, about the gradual driving down of the priestesses in Mesopotamia. But again, going back to Southeast Africa, there are these oracular priestesses in Malawi and Zimbabwe, and we can sometimes see shadows of this in the rock art. So in the Shona tradition, they refer to lion oracles who are called Mondoro. And the title of Nehanda, we're going to come to that again, I think later, is tied in with that. But in Malawi, the title for the Rain Shrine Oracles, who were the primary spiritual authority in the Chewa society, they were called Makewana, which means mother of children. Not because they were biological mothers, but they were seen as the guiding principle for the entire society and the prophetic source. And we see also female diviners in the Mixtec codexes that have survived the Spanish conquest. So you have consultation of an oracle going on there, as well as shown here in the Florentine Codex. The men at the top are asking questions. They're also crying. The woman has her spirit guide there behind her. And at the bottom, she's got a mat spread out, and she's casting shells as lots. And they're both speaking back and forth, and she's telling him things. The Moche culture that I referred to earlier, there is kind of a peyote culture with the Wachuma buttons, cactus buttons, that were also entheogenic. And so you see women chewing wachuma and sometimes gesturing as if they're speaking and prophesying. And also there's the healers. And this is a whole set of presentations in its own right. But we have examples here from Zimbabwe and Burundi, paintings by an English woman that was recording these cultures. And so this takes us to the medicine women in North America, and these very impressive-looking female elders who are healers and prophets in their own traditions, the Mashkikiwe, as they're called in their language. In California, you have the last of the Bole Maro dreamers is a woman named Essie Parrish among the Kashaya Pomo, and there is a wonderful movie of her on YouTube that you can see called Pomo Shaman. And I really recommend it because her doctoring songs, she made sure to get the anthropologists to record her doing ceremony with the doctoring songs, which are so moving. And a whole chorus of people with elder clappers, mostly women, singing along with her in that ceremonial space. And so in each tradition, we can track women who are leaders of their communities. Gladys Tantaquidgeon in the Mohegan culture of Connecticut, they're wearing a belt that she has inherited several generations down from previous medicine women. And the Mapuche people in southern Chile have female shamans predominantly who are called machi. And again, the sacred drum, the cultrun, is part of their ceremonial. Again, ecstatic traditions. So this idea of shaman originates from a group of people in northeastern Asia, but we have female shamans over many of the Asian cultures. They're not all matricultural societies, many of them are patriarchal, but this remains a female sphere of power in a great many societies. And so we have the shamans of the Tungu-speaking peoples, the Evenki, and various Manchu peoples, like the Dagur. And the sacred drum and dance is really central to this, of how do you attain unification with the divine in your consciousness through chant and incantation and movement with dance. And there's an overlap there. This is something I kept finding, was that the women who were political leaders very often had a spiritual foundation to their public authority. And you can see it in this photo. This is like a US bureaucratic journal here, the Bulletin of Ethnography, but you can see the regalia of her. It's not strictly a political position. She's also a medicine woman. And this is something, a correlation that recurs even in the founding stories of the Quechua people, the so-called Incas, right? The Coya was the female counterpart of the Inca. And so the founding Coya was called Mama Huaco, which we could translate as Sacred Mother, or some form thereof. And she is the one who does a divination. She casts something into the air. I can't remember what it was. And where it lands, that is where they found Cusco. And then in tribal parts of India, you also have stories of female founders, like Tukizi in the Toda culture, and she is a founder who put her hand to the various works at the beginning. So she's a creator figure, but she's also a culture maker. And it's she who divides and gives the clans and the buffaloes, the sacred places and ceremonies to the Toda people. But it's really become very patriarchal. So this is like a memory of an older social order. And as I mentioned before, you have the cacica that shocked the Spanish when they came in to 16th century Colombia and found that some of the chiefs were female. And we have the perplexing reaction of the Chinese. They called, in this painting, it says, Nurenguo, above the women who are drumming there, and they're calling it a country of women. And they pointed over also to the West, and they said certain parts of Tibet were also countries of women. And we see this same colonial perplex when the Anglos and the French came in to North America, and they had women who were appearing to conduct diplomatic negotiations. And they were not used to this. They knew that there was such a thing as queens, who may or may not have been rulers, but here Aliquippa is parleying with Lieutenant George Washington. This is before he became a general. And so there is this clash between indigenous societies and colonial societies. That's a whole subject. But even in patriarchal societies, there's this persistence of female spheres of power. In many cases, it is in the spiritual realm. Some cases, like in West Africa, the market women were very powerful force. There's an example in China as late as the 7th century of a Wu who was named Chen Jinggu. And there's an epic about her. She was said to have founded a shamanic sisterhood at Mount Liu, her and another tiger woman, and she was a powerful healer. But what happens in her story is she's remembered as a marriage resistor. She takes a lover, she gets pregnant, but then it's time for her to fight the white dragon. And so she does a ceremonial abortion and fights the dragon. And then she gets turned by the keepers. Again, the gatekeepers make a new story, and now she becomes a goddess of childbirth, and not at all a marriage resistor anymore, and she becomes a goddess called the Lady of Lin Shui. So there are all these tangles and angles to the way stories get overwritten and turned around. Writers, and Hedwana, the oldest known named author in world history, who wrote Ninme Sara, the exaltation of Inanna. And so we have various Babylonian records also talking about women who were scribes. There were business women who were probably also literate to conduct their affairs. We have a few examples also from Egypt of female scribes. And there's an example there from the Florentine Codex, again, of an Aztec woman scribe. Maria Bartola de Iztapalapa wrote a history of the Spanish conquest, which the colonials then burned, but she has been credited as the first historian of Mexico. We have female scribes and also scholars in India, and so she's holding up the palm leaf scripture there in her hand. This is from her funerary monument. And there was a Tifinagh alphabet among the Amazigh, the so-called Tuareg people of the Sahara. And women were teaching their daughters this alphabet. And so you have this maternal transmission of scribing, which also we may have seen happening when women in central China invented a secret female script. It might look like Chinese to us, but it's not Chinese. It is their own form of writing. And the way it was invented was because women were being patriarchally married out, and they lost contact with their best friends, their laotong, their sworn sisters. And so they would send messages inscribed on paper or on fans, different things, and they would stay in touch with each other through this. So a very subversive use of writing by women. And you have, of course, famous poets, and we could do a whole show about that, but I'm very interested in this figure whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, because she was a concubine or a third wife or whatever, and she calls this being like the maid, but without the pay. But the little excerpt that is shown there, she's talking about, she's got all the care of dealing with the children, and here, she's got too many already, and here's her husband sliding onto her stomach, and there's nothing really to say about it. The trapped state, the lack of control over her own body of the wife or the concubine or the enslaved woman. And then another writer, Masati Ganjavi, an Azeri woman from between Turkey and Iran. And she was a Sufi poet and also a freethinker. She was very outspoken against the enforcement of dogmatic religious authority. So we have the female scientists, and very often these women would have access through their fathers in patriarchal societies. Sometimes the mothers could teach them, but it was the fathers that had the power to say yay or nay. And so women who entered medicine, or in this case, astronomy, the same was true of Hypatia and Alexandria. The access was from a father that was willing to educate his daughter. In Europe, there was a whole battle, as you know, for women to get into the universities at all, and some of the most fraught areas were in the sciences, particularly in medicine. So this is a leader of the Edinburgh Seven of British women who fought to study medicine, and they were harassed through their entire period of study. And finally, when they sat for their exam at the University of Edinburgh, the male students rioted, and they were nevertheless the first women to get their degrees. And this continued to be an ongoing problem of recognition for women in the sciences, because they would do the work, like Rosalind Franklin famously was the one who first photographed the double helix, and the Nobel Prize went instead to Watson and Crick, who didn't even hardly mention her. So there is this stealing of women's work, the passing over of achievements of women, and often the claiming of credit for them by men. And so Matilda Jocelyn Gage named this pattern. She was a very important feminist historian and political activist in the late, and it was through most of the 1800s actually. And so we're referring to this pattern because she first recognized it. And then we have also the overlay of not only patriarchy but colonial conquest. And so women in the African diaspora are trafficked across the Middle Passage, and they wind up in Brazil, but they use their Angolan or their Congo or their Yoruba traditions, their Dahomean traditions, they transplant them, and they become not only a source of spiritual succor and support, emotional support, but also of political resistance. And so the Mãe de Santo in Brazil, or earlier on they called them the Calundureiras, which is from an Angolan name meaning the women who venerate the ancestors. But also the Mães de Ocha, the Santeras, as they were called in Spanish, the Santeria religion, or Lucumi, in the Caribbean. And I will include in this also the Haitian Mambos, bastions of female resistance. And here again we see the spiritual fusing with the political. And so I'm hoping to get this show up on the Suppressed Histories open access. I have it behind a paywall right now, stream on demand. But Rebel Shamans, Women Confront Empire. These are almost entirely indigenous women, especially in Africa and the Americas, who use their position as spirit diviners or medicine women or whatever they may be in their home culture to lead revolts against invasion, colonization, or insurrection against already the rulership. And so just right here, not far away, Mission San Gabriel, right? You have Toipurina of the Quiche Nation, some say Tongva, who was very young, and she was planning a revolt against the slavery of the mission system, was betrayed, and then the whole thing was overthrown before it really got started. But important figures like this, Lozen, a medicine woman who was also a warrior, who was also woman-loving, a leader, and you can see her in the painting there with Geronimo, who she joined forces with. and eventually captured they surrendered actually to the U.S. Army, which deported them all to the Gulf where she died of TB. Teresa Urrea, the Santa de Cabora, was a woman who her mother was native, her father was a big ranch owner, so there's colonial pattern right there we could look at. But she was attacked and nearly killed by a rapist when she was 15. But she survived, and when she came to, they were ready to bury her. And she comes to, and she starts speaking of the visions of La Santa Virgen that she had had. And she suddenly now has the power to cure and to foretell things. She becomes a political activist for which she is expelled from Mexico by the dictator Porfirio Diaz. And she is in exile in the United States and going around El Paso doing these healings and continuing to agitate. She's basically a forerunner of the Mexican Revolution. That name of the lion oracle, Nahanda, which was founded by a princess who fled from her father's attempt to force her to marry her brother in the kingdom of Wanamotapa, she flees to a cave and she becomes the first Nahanda, and there's a whole line of Nahandas that followed after, the lion oracles. This Nahanda, Nyakasikana, led the first Chimurenga, the revolt against English invasion under Cecil Rhodes. And eventually she surrenders because they were using machine guns and explosives against the Shona. So to save them, she surrendered and they executed her for sedition. Tang Sai-er, either a Taoist or a Buddhist nun who led a revolt against the Ming Empire. You see the date there. And so there's a lot of stories about women warriors. This again is an entire subject for an entire presentation, but just to give you a little taste of Yanenga, Burkina Faso. We have the Trung sisters in Vietnam in the year 40 fighting the Chinese Empire. This is from a temple in their honor in the Middle Ages. And we have Boudica of the Akene, a tribe of people in western, what's now England, who led a revolt against the Roman Empire. A Kiowa woman warrior from the reservation ledger book art in the early period of conquest. Rogue River Mary, less known figure, teenager once again, so was Joan of Arc for that matter, who rode up and down across the hills in her region near Wolf Creek, Oregon, to lead a fight that actually eventually they were victorious. But there was a very genocidal campaign by settler militias against Native people in Oregon. So all these are dangerous women for fighting back. It's not because they're harm doers by nature. And you find all kinds of ways of fighting back, whether it's through the martial arts. One of the Shaolin masters that escapes the imperial Chinese repression, it was Mui, and is considered ultimately the founder of Wing Chun Kung Fu, which he teaches to a young woman. And we have also the non-violent method of resistance. So there's a story in the Nizami's Hamsa about an old woman who he does not name, who the tyrannical sultan, she goes up to him, she grabs his horse bridle, and she begins to berate him for all the atrocities he'd been committing against people. And she got away with it. And the Afghans still remember her. The Women's War of 1929, which is also called the Abu Rebellion, were Igbo women who refused to be taxed by the colonial warrant chiefs. These were men that the British put in power over the Igbo. And the women absolutely refused, and they tore off their clothes and they put on leaf regalia that was part of their ceremonial culture, and they marched through town and they besieged the chief's house and they cut telegraph wires and they got the tax revoked. And that woman there, Nyanwe, let me go back. Nyanyerua was the woman that sparked off the whole revolt. So we could go on about female rebels and mavericks against patriarchy, against conquest, and women writers, women speakers who spoke up. We certainly could look at religious women, first the early Baptists, later on the Quakers, or actually first I would have to name the Catholic heretics. You know, there's Prus Boneta and other figures. To speak in public, not just to preach about religion, but to speak at all in public was considered forbidden. And some of those Pauline injunctions or pseudo-Pauline injunctions against women's speech in church were being invoked by black ministers when Maria Stuart stood up and speaking both for women's liberation and black liberation with one voice. And they eventually forced her out of town. But we have Fatemeh Baraghaini in Iran, and she was part of the Baha'i movement, which was originally called the Babi movement. And so she was a female teacher behind a curtain, taught theology in Iraq, came back to Iran, and was part of the Babi movement. She scandalized the men at the Babi conference by tearing off her veil and passionately preaching. And shortly after that, some men surrounded her at home and strangled her with her own veil. Kushida Choshiko, the first public woman speaker in Japan, a fiery feminist who gathered crowds around her with her passionate oratory and spoke about daughters I can't read it. Daughters in boxes, because, you know, keeping women home, keeping girls home, and the confinement that girls were subject to. And I especially like this line: the government is the force over men, and men is the force over women. She had her analysis, and this is something that was also spoken to by Gabriela Mistral and Flora Tristan in South America. And then this is a lesbian figure, Frances Power Cobb, who wrote Wife Torture in England. It was actually a lot of it about femicide as well as battering. But she also penned a poem that had a refrain, "I want you, Mary." So this is very revolutionary in her time period. And so we have the whole history of lesbian heritages that we've been recollecting over time. I have a whole visual talk about that, of the Thai women there in the lower panel, squeezing each other's breasts in bed. And this figure, I think, is so interesting. She was a Polish Jew who migrates to the Americas. She becomes a leftist activist who goes around selling anarchist newspapers. She eventually joins Emma Goldman's Mother Earth publication, but then she lands in New York City and she founds Eve's Tea Room, which is a lesbian and gay center, a coffee house. And so it was called a place where ladies prefer each other. She's eventually exiled because of this, thrown back to Europe. She takes up residence again in Paris, but then the Nazis invade, and she ends up being killed in Auschwitz. In El Salvador, we have Prudencia Ayala, who was an indigenous and African-descended woman who was illiterate, born into a literate family, taught herself to read and write, became a journalist, advocated for women's rights and labor rights, and in 1930 ran for president, even though women didn't yet have the right to vote. And her newspaper that she founded is called Female Redemption. And Jovita Ibar, also a journalist, but a publisher as well, her family had a printing press. And so she was advocating for female suffrage, but also for Mexican rights, because Texas was really rough to be Mexican in her lifespan. And so she winds up at one point facing down a whole group of mounted Texas Rangers who wanted to come and destroy her press. And she stood them off and they went away. So finally, I'm winding up here. Frida Husson, this is one of the matrilineal traditions in Western Canada. These are Diné family speakers. And the Wet'suwet'en Nation has been fighting for years now because they have the right. They never signed a treaty with the Canadian government. This is their lands, and they're forcing a gas pipeline across Canada that they're trying to stop because it means digging up their lands. And so she is both a chief and a ceremonial leader and a leader of the political resistance there. And this is part of the whole wave of rematriation movements that are happening among Indigenous women all over North America and elsewhere. And so, for example, in North California really, we have Kayleen Sisk, who is both the chief and also the spiritual leader of the Winnemem-Winto. These are river people. Their lands were partly flooded by the Shasta Dam, and now the government is talking about flooding the rest of them. And she's fighting it. She's a water protector. And she also reignited the womanhood initiation ceremonies of her tradition that is called the Balas Chona ceremonies. And she's had to fight the government on that as well because the sacred lands are invaded by yahoos and drunken boaters. So rematriating, we have to rematriate everything. The society, our relations with each other, our relations with the land, recover the respect for the earth. And so there's much more to tell than, I've already stacked a lot of info in here for you, but this is a good place to stop. And I refer you also, a lot of this information is not yet on the website, but it will be within a year. We're in that process of fundraising to do this and to make this open access to everyone. But in the meantime, you can go through the photo section of the Suppressed Histories Archives on Facebook, and a lot of this material is there. So with that, I'll close, and I thank you again for hosting me. Yeah. I mean, if we want to do a discussion, we can do that. Grazie.
Please come purchase the books and the DVD.
Yeah, so, I mean, don't be shy if you have a comment or question. I'm here. I know I loaded a lot of information on you. I always forget to say at the beginning, just let it wash over you, you know, just to feel it at least at that level, because nobody can remember all that. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's just amazing. There's so much there. I just can't even believe it. But I can't help but think about the way a lot of the Facebook, TikTok things that I'm seeing online now, because I'm watching all of it, of the women standing up to the ICE agents and the raids.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's such a reflection and a connection to that I see. So
it's really a pattern historically. If you look at the Russian Revolution and the March on the Winter Palace, or the women marching on Versailles, it's often the women who, you know, the conditions become so desperate, and they're the ones who stand up. And this is the Rebel Shaman show. This was also the pattern there.
And they're the ones that suffer the most. So that's,
yes,
I think, why they're standing up.
And you know, what you're raising, too, is that, you know, you remember the scene in Tiananmen Square where the one guy stood and stopped all the tanks? There's now a picture from New York Chinatown of a woman doing that in front of an
The one in a polka dot dress. Yeah.
So,
yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else got a comment or a question? I made a long night of it for you, I realize that, but here's one over here.
Linda, hang on. All right, yeah, it is on. Along the lines of, I don't know her name, of women gathering and standing the ICE down. I actually have thought about that. So maybe it's possible.
Well, it's happening.
Oh, well, let's go. I'm serious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the last thing we can do is to let them convince us that there's no way to resist. It's happening in all these different ways, you know. And a lot of courage is showing up that make people feel good about being American for the first time in a very long time, you know. It's like, no, we're not having this. Okay, they're a very quiet crowd. Last chance.
I just want to say thank you so much for your amazing presentation, and to go back to that time in 1968 when you walked out of Harvard and knew that you could never learn this stuff under a patriarchal institution of that kind. This is a crass question. This stuff you're putting on Facebook, you're doing open access. You referred to raising money so you can put the next of it up there.
Okay, right.
So how are you supporting Suppressed Histories Archive?
Well, this has been the thing. I mean, I just basically have been supporting it through my own earnings, doing visual talks. I teach online courses, you know, I have Zooms every month that on one of these subjects. A lot of the videos I refer to are Zoom recordings. But the videos, like some of them I have stream on demand because I have to keep a roof over not just my head, but the archives. There's just hasn't been any funding. This is outside institutional frameworks. And so what I want to do is I have video recordings going back years and years by now that I want to put out open access. Right now they exist as stream on demand, so Rebel Shamans and Witches and Pagans and a lot of the other subjects that I've covered are under that. So what I want to do is get a licensing agreement, because the Suppressed Histories Archives went nonprofit 4 years ago. And we need to get it so that I can get at least paid something to survive, because there's no other stream than what I earn, to make these open access so that anybody with a mobile device can see them. You know, women in any part of the world who has that access could then see them digitally. That's the goal. And the other thing that we're fundraising for is that basically 15 years worth of daily photo essays on the Facebook page, Suppressed Histories Archives. We've succeeded in migrating them over. They sit in a database on the website. But they're all marked with database entry codes, which are numbers, right? And so what we have to do is we have to tag all the content, you know, of subject, place, peoples, and then arrange it. They have to be aggregated by subject. So like a whole group of navigation pages on healers, builders, farmers, freethinkers, doctors, scientists, women, clan heads, all the subjects that you see covered here need to have a navigation page, and then down there will be links to all the articles. But so we have to do the tagging work, and that's a whole thing. And we have to also build a new CSS framework for the website. So that means getting tech people involved and paying them to do this. And so that's where we are now, is just getting that process. I'm trying to get the design framework up first. And then it's going to start pouring out after that. So all these years of invisible content will suddenly be on the website and ultimately searchable. So if you're going in there looking for oracles, you can find all the references to oracles, whatever it may be. So it's a lot for one person, because I'm doing all of these things, and I'm just trying to get a little more funding stream behind it so that it's available, right? So that there's access. Yeah. That's why.
May I join the chorus of praise for your widespread reach into culture. I'm an anthropologist by training, so I'm so glad you went deep into the Paleolithic as well as cross-culturally so brilliantly. I have a question about the future for us, and one about my own experiences in an irrigated rice culture of Indonesia, where I saw women not only doing work, but also coordinating everything having to do with the agricultural process. And then they were also, in their spiritual lives, extremely important, because they would often go into trance. And in trance, they would then be in touch with the ancestors and bring back this answers the villagers had about, why do we have conflict? How do we solve this conflict? And they would know because of their being in trance with
and they would be listened
with
to.
the mothers.
That's the other important part.
Exactly right. They were listened to. People followed them. They were the equivalent of your wise women in the Iroquois tradition.
I'm curious, what cultures were you working among?
Particularly the Balinese.
Balinese, yeah. Bali's kind of famous for the trance.
That's right.
You know, and the rice paddy spirits.
The sense of power, of spiritual and economic power together.
Yeah, sure.
I happen to have had some students in a little college in Massachusetts who ended up making films, here Sarah Botzing and Ken Burns, and they are coming out with a film on the American Revolution of 250 years ago this year, and it will be shown during November on PBS. I have heard that they have really worked hard to have people's voices, that are unexpected voices, not that only of George Washington, etc.
For sure.
But also of many women who were involved in the revolution, and of course the role of the indigenous people in giving the frame to the Constitution of wise women as the Supreme Court. At any rate, I'll be interested in what you and others in this group can actually see in a film of contemporary relevance like that is helpful to this cause, and perhaps we can have some dialogues about that here at Pilgrim Place. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you once again.
Thank you for bringing me.